I'm Emma Rodriguez, and the people who raised me to look both ways before crossing the street are the same ones who deliberately led me into oncoming traffic. What started as a family dinner discussing my brother Tyler's medical bills ended with me discovering my parents had orchestrated a car accident to collect insurance money, using me as their unwilling victim. I thought the screeching tires and shattered glass were just bad luck until I found the text messages planning my near-death experience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona felt like living in a sun-soaked postcard most days. The Rodriguez family called Sunset Ridge home, a modest neighborhood where desert landscaping met middle-class dreams and everyone knew their neighbor's business. Our single-story ranch house with its terracotta tile roof and carefully maintained xeriscaped front yard represented everything my parents worked toward since immigrating from Mexico 25 years earlier. My father, Michael, built his life around honest work and family pride. He owned Rodriguez Auto Repair on the south side of town, a small shop where he'd earned a reputation for fair prices and quality work. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and he took genuine pride in keeping our community's cars running safely. Every evening, he'd wash those hands with industrial soap, sit at our kitchen table, and ask about our days with the focused attention of someone who understood that family conversations were sacred time. My mother, Patricia, embodied the heart of our household while maintaining her career as a guidance counselor at Desert Vista High School. She possessed this remarkable ability to make everyone feel heard and valued, whether she was helping troubled teenagers navigate their futures or mediating disputes between Tyler and me when we were younger. Mom collected inspirational quotes and kept them pinned to a corkboard in our kitchen, little reminders that hard work and faith could overcome any obstacle life presented. Tyler, my younger brother by 3 years, had always been the family's wild card. Where I approached life with careful planning and measured decisions, Tyler seemed to dance through existence on pure impulse and charm. He could make anyone laugh. Within 5 minutes of meeting them, possessed an infectious enthusiasm for whatever captured his interest that week, and had this way of making you believe that everything would work out fine because Tyler said so. Growing up, his energy balanced my more serious nature perfectly. Our family functioned like a well-oiled machine throughout my childhood and teenage years. Sunday barbecues in our backyard were neighborhood institutions, complete with Dad's famous carne asada and Mom's homemade salsa verde. Relatives would gather around our picnic table under the ramada Dad built himself, sharing stories and laughter that carried across the desert evening air. During these gatherings, Tyler would entertain everyone with his latest adventures, while I helped Mom serve drinks and coordinate the logistics that made everything run smoothly. Education and personal responsibility formed the foundation of our family values. Both parents had worked multiple jobs to put themselves through community college while raising young children, and they impressed upon Tyler and me that education was the pathway to opportunities they'd never had. My report cards earned places of honor on the refrigerator, and academic achievements were celebrated with the same enthusiasm as birthdays. When I expressed interest in becoming a physical therapist during my sophomore year of high school, both parents researched programs and helped me understand the commitment required to succeed in healthcare. Tyler's path through adolescence proved more complicated than mine, though none of us recognized the warning signs at the time. His natural charm and social ease made him popular at school, but his grades reflected a lack of focus rather than inability. He'd start projects with tremendous enthusiasm, only to abandon them when something more interesting appeared. Teachers consistently noted his potential while expressing frustration with his inconsistent effort. My parents approached these challenges with patience and support, believing Tyler would eventually find his direction as he matured. Throughout high school, I maintained a clear vision of my future, while Tyler seemed content to live in the moment. I worked part-time at a local pharmacy to save money for college, studied diligently to maintain my GPA, and volunteered at a physical therapy clinic to gain experience in my chosen field. Tyler played guitar in a series of short-lived bands, dated different girls each semester, and talked about maybe studying music or business or film production depending on his mood that week. Our parents treated these differences as natural variations in personality rather than causes for concern. College represented the first time Tyler and I lived separate lives for extended periods. I attended Arizona State University for my physical therapy program, living in dorms and later apartments near campus while maintaining regular contact with family. Tyler started at Phoenix Community College with plans to transfer after completing his general education requirements, but those plans shifted frequently as his interests changed. He lived at home during this period, which allowed our parents to monitor his progress and provide support when needed. During my sophomore year at ASU, I met Jake Morrison in an anatomy class we both needed for our respective programs. Jake was studying accounting with the same methodical approach I brought to physical therapy, and we bonded over shared study sessions and similar values about building stable careers. He possessed a quiet confidence that complemented my more outgoing nature, and his steady presence became a source of comfort during the stressful periods of our demanding academic programs. Jake grew up in Tempe with parents who emphasized financial responsibility and long-term planning, values that aligned perfectly with the work ethic my parents had instilled in me. Our relationship developed slowly and thoughtfully, built on genuine compatibility rather than dramatic passion. He supported my career goals without trying to overshadow them, and I appreciated his level-headed approach to problems and decision-making. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By my senior year, we were discussing marriage and our shared vision of building a life together in Arizona. While my relationship with Jake deepened and my career path solidified, Tyler's college experience became increasingly erratic. He changed majors 3 times, withdrew from several classes, and eventually dropped out during his second year without completing enough credits to transfer. Our parents expressed disappointment but remained supportive, helping him find work at a warehouse while he figured out his next steps. Tyler assured everyone this was just a temporary setback while he explored other options. The first real indication of Tyler's substance abuse problems emerged during my final semester of college. Mom called me one evening, her voice strained with worry, to explain that Tyler had been arrested for possession of marijuana and driving under the influence. The charges were relatively minor, but they represented a concerning escalation in behavior our family had been reluctant to acknowledge. Dad hired a lawyer to help Tyler navigate the legal system, and Mom arranged for him to attend counseling sessions through her school's employee assistance program. Tyler approached his legal troubles with the same casual attitude he brought to most challenges, assuring everyone that this was an isolated incident resulting from hanging out with the wrong crowd. He attended his required counseling sessions, paid his fines, and completed community service while maintaining that the whole situation was blown out of proportion. Our parents wanted to believe him, and honestly, so did I. The alternative seemed too frightening to consider for a family that had always prided itself on staying together through any difficulty. After graduating with my Doctor of Physical Therapy degree, I accepted a position at Desert Springs Rehabilitation Center, a well-respected facility specializing in post-surgical recovery and chronic pain management. The work proved challenging and rewarding, allowing me to help patients regain mobility and independence after accidents, surgeries, or degenerative conditions. My colleagues appreciated my combination of clinical skills and genuine empathy for patient concerns, and I quickly established myself as a reliable team member. Jake and I moved in together after I started working, renting a small apartment in Scottsdale that represented our first step toward building an independent life as a couple. We established routines around our respective careers, maintained close relationships with both families, and began seriously discussing marriage and our long-term goals. Jake's steady income from his accounting firm combined with my healthcare salary provided financial stability neither of us had experienced during our student years. Tyler's struggles continued to escalate despite our family's efforts to provide support and accountability. The warehouse job ended when he stopped showing up consistently, followed by a series of short-term positions that never lasted more than a few months. His casual marijuana use had progressed to prescription painkillers, which he initially claimed were prescribed for a back injury from lifting heavy boxes at work. When pressed for details, his explanations became increasingly vague and defensive. The prescription painkiller phase transitioned into heroin use sometime during my second year of employment, though Tyler managed to hide the severity of his addiction for several months. He'd lost significant weight, which he attributed to stress about finding steady employment. His mood swings became more pronounced, alternating between periods of manic energy and deep lethargy that he blamed on depression. My parents tried various interventions, from family counseling to tough love approaches, but Tyler always managed to convince them he was getting better just before things reached a crisis point. Jake and I had been living together for nearly 2 years when Tyler's addiction finally reached a level that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Mom found him unconscious in his bedroom after he'd failed to respond to repeated knocking, and paramedics had to administer Narcan to reverse what appeared to be a near-fatal overdose. The hospital stay that followed included medical detox and psychiatric evaluation, marking the first time our family confronted the full scope of Tyler's substance abuse problems. The financial burden of Tyler's addiction treatment began straining our family's resources almost immediately. Dad's auto repair shop provided steady income, but not the kind of money required for residential rehabilitation programs, medical bills, and legal fees associated with Tyler's drug-related arrests. Mom's teacher salary contributed to household expenses, but left little room for unexpected costs. They'd already depleted their modest savings account covering Tyler's previous legal troubles and failed attempts at outpatient treatment. During family meetings at the hospital, counselors explained that Tyler's best chance for long-term recovery required intensive inpatient treatment, followed by extended aftercare support. The recommended program cost $47,000 for the initial 90-day phase, with additional expenses for continued outpatient services, medication management, and transitional housing. Even with their health insurance covering a portion of the medical costs, my parents faced financial obligations that far exceeded their ability to pay. Jake and I offered to help with whatever we could afford from our savings, though our contribution would barely make a dent in the total expenses. We were still establishing our careers and had been saving money for our own future goals, including marriage and eventually buying a home together. Nevertheless, Tyler was family, and we felt obligated to support any effort that might save his life and give him a chance at sustained recovery. Mom spent countless hours researching financial assistance programs, contacting charitable organizations, and exploring loan options that might bridge the gap between what insurance covered and what the treatment center required. She applied for grants through nonprofit organizations dedicated to addiction recovery, contacted religious charities, and even considered starting a crowdfunding campaign to raise money from our extended community. Every avenue she explored either had waiting lists, strict eligibility requirements, or simply insufficient funding to meet the overwhelming demand for assistance. The financial pressure created additional stress in our family relationships, as everyone grappled with impossible choices between Tyler's immediate needs and long-term financial stability. Dad considered taking out a second mortgage on the house, but the monthly payments would have stretched their budget beyond sustainability. Mom looked into borrowing against her retirement account, though the penalties and tax implications would have devastating consequences for their future security. Every potential solution seemed to create new problems without guaranteeing Tyler's recovery. Tyler himself contributed to the family's financial stress through his continued drug use and inability to maintain employment during his brief periods of sobriety. Each relapse resulted in additional emergency room visits, legal complications, or property damage that required immediate attention and money our family didn't have. His promises to get clean and contribute to the cost of his treatment were undermined by the reality of addiction's grip on his decision-making and behavior. 3 months after Tyler's overdose, our family gathered for what Mom called an urgent discussion about our options moving forward. The recommended treatment program had offered to hold Tyler's spot for an additional 30 days, but they required a substantial down payment to secure his admission. Dad had been working overtime at the shop. Mom had picked up tutoring work in the evenings, and both parents looked exhausted from the combination of financial pressure and emotional strain. Jake and I arrived at my parents' house that Sunday evening expecting another brainstorming session about fundraising strategies or payment plans. The atmosphere felt different from previous family meetings, more tense and purposeful in a way. That made me uncomfortable. Tyler wasn't present, which Mom explained by saying he was attending a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, though something about her tone suggested this might not be entirely accurate. The conversation began normally enough, with Dad reviewing their latest calculations about treatment costs and available resources. They'd managed to secure some additional financial assistance through Mom's employee benefits program, and a local charity had approved a small grant to help with initial expenses. However, they were still short approximately $28,000, an amount that seemed insurmountable given their current financial situation. As the evening progressed, Mom's questions began focusing on topics that seemed tangentially related to Tyler's treatment costs. She asked detailed questions about my car insurance coverage, whether I'd updated my beneficiaries recently, and if I understood the full extent of my policy's medical and disability benefits. When I asked why these details mattered for Tyler's situation, she explained that they were exploring every possible resource and wanted to ensure our family was maximizing all available insurance benefits. Dad's contributions to the conversation centered around technical aspects of automotive safety and accident reconstruction, subjects that seemed oddly specific for a general discussion about financial planning. He described various types of vehicle collisions, their typical causes, and the range of injuries commonly associated with different accident scenarios. When Jake asked about the relevance of this information, Dad suggested that understanding risk management was important for young adults starting their careers and planning their futures. The discussion concluded without any concrete decisions about Tyler's treatment funding, though both parents seemed more optimistic than they had in weeks. They thanked Jake and me for our continued support and mentioned that they'd scheduled another family meeting for the following weekend to finalize their approach. As we drove home that evening, Jake expressed confusion about the direction the conversation had taken, noting that many of the topics seemed unrelated to addiction treatment or financial planning. I shared Jake's puzzlement about the evening's discussion, but attributed our parents' scattered focus to the overwhelming stress they'd been experiencing. Managing Tyler's addiction crisis while working full-time and maintaining their household responsibilities would challenge anyone's ability to think clearly and communicate effectively. Their questions about insurance coverage and accident risks seemed like the kind of tangential concerns that might occupy worried parents' minds when facing an impossible situation. The following week passed without major incidents, though Tyler's behavior became increasingly erratic as his access to drugs fluctuated with his available money and connections. He'd disappear for days at a time, return home in various states of intoxication or withdrawal, and create chaos that disrupted our parents' attempts to maintain normal routines. Each crisis reinforced the urgency of getting him into residential treatment while simultaneously making that goal seem more financially impossible. On Thursday evening, Mom called to invite Jake and me for dinner on Saturday, mentioning that she wanted to cook Tyler's favorite meal as a way of encouraging him to spend time with family instead of using drugs. She also suggested that I drive my Honda Civic rather than riding with Jake, explaining that she needed me to run an errand after dinner that would be easier with my own transportation. The request seemed reasonable, so I agreed without asking for additional details about the errand or its timing. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that made living in the desert feel like a privilege rather than a challenge. I drove to my parents' house through familiar neighborhoods, enjoying the mountain views and clear skies that never failed to lift my spirits despite our family's current struggles. Tyler's car was in the driveway when I arrived, suggesting he'd followed through on his promise to join us for dinner rather than disappearing with his friends, as had become his recent pattern. The evening began pleasantly enough, with Mom serving Tyler's requested meal and everyone making an effort to keep conversation light and positive. Tyler seemed more present and engaged than he had in months, asking about my work and Jake's accounting projects with genuine interest rather than the distracted politeness that characterized most of our recent interactions. For a few hours, our family dinner felt almost normal, reminiscent of the comfortable gatherings we'd enjoyed before addiction complicated everything. After dessert, Mom mentioned the errand she'd discussed earlier, explaining that she needed me to pick up some medical forms from Tyler's previous counselor's office across town. The office was located in an area I wasn't particularly familiar with, but she provided detailed directions and assured me the drive would only take about 30 minutes round trip. Tyler offered to come along for company, which seemed like a positive sign of his desire to stay engaged with family activities rather than isolating himself. The drive across Phoenix that Saturday evening started like any routine family favor. Tyler climbed into the passenger seat of my Honda Civic with more energy than I'd seen from him in weeks, actually buckling his seatbelt without the usual reminders about safety that had become necessary during his worst periods of drug use. Mom handed me a manila envelope containing what she claimed were insurance forms needed for Tyler's treatment approval, along with the address of the counseling office where we needed to deliver them before their Monday morning deadline. The GA route took us through parts of Phoenix I rarely visited, winding through older neighborhoods where single-story homes from the 1960s sat behind chain-link fences and desert landscaping that had seen better days. Tyler seemed genuinely interested in conversation during the drive, asking about my patients at the rehabilitation center and sharing stories about people he'd met in various recovery programs. His questions felt thoughtful rather than the scattered attempts at engagement that characterized most of our recent interactions. As we drove, Tyler mentioned how grateful he felt for our family's support, despite all the chaos he'd caused over the past 2 years. He acknowledged the financial burden his addiction had placed on Mom and Dad, expressing genuine remorse for the way his choices had affected everyone's plans and security. These moments of clarity had become rare treasures during his struggle. With heroin, brief glimpses of the brother I'd grown up loving before substances clouded his judgment and personality. The counseling office was located in a strip mall between a discount grocery store and a nail salon, exactly the kind of generic medical complex that dotted Phoenix's sprawling suburban landscape. Mom had warned me that the office might appear closed from the outside, but that someone would be waiting inside to receive the paperwork. She'd specifically mentioned that Dr. Martinez, Tyler's former counselor, had agreed to meet us after hours as a personal favor since the forms were crucial for treatment approval. When we arrived at the strip mall, most of the businesses appeared closed for the evening, with only a few cars scattered across the large parking lot. The counseling office showed no exterior lights, and I couldn't see any signs of activity through the tinted windows. Tyler suggested we wait a few minutes in case Dr. Martinez was running late, so I parked facing the office entrance and left the engine running while we watched for any indication that someone was inside waiting for us. After 15 minutes of waiting without seeing any movement in the office, I decided to call Mom for clarification about the appointment time and location. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which seemed odd since she'd been expecting us to complete this errand and should have been available to provide guidance if complications arose. Tyler tried calling Dad's cell phone with the same result, leaving us uncertain about whether we'd misunderstood the arrangements or if Dr. Martinez had been delayed. The situation felt increasingly awkward as we sat in the empty parking lot, without clear direction about how to proceed. Tyler seemed as confused as I was about the lack of communication from our parents or the counselor, though he remained patient and supportive rather than becoming agitated as he might have during his more unstable periods. We decided to wait another 10 minutes before giving up and returning home to clarify the situation with Mom and Dad. During this waiting period, Tyler opened up about his fears regarding the upcoming treatment program and his uncertainty about whether he possessed the strength to overcome his addiction permanently. He'd attempted sobriety multiple times over the past 2 years, only to relapse within weeks or months when life stresses became overwhelming. The prospect of 90 days in residential treatment simultaneously offered hope and triggered anxiety about failing again in front of everyone who'd invested so much in his recovery. These conversations reminded me why I'd always felt protective of Tyler despite his recent struggles. Underneath the addiction and poor decisions lived the sensitive, creative person who'd been my closest companion throughout childhood. His current crisis felt like watching someone I loved drowning while being unable to throw them an effective lifeline. Every small sign of progress, like his engagement during tonight's drive, seemed precious and fragile. When Dr. Martinez still hadn't appeared after our extended wait, we decided to return home and clarify the situation with our parents. Tyler suggested leaving the envelope with the security guard at the building's main entrance, but I preferred to get explicit instructions from Mom rather than risk mishandling important paperwork. The drive back across town gave us more time to talk about Tyler's hopes for treatment and his plans for rebuilding his life once he achieved stable sobriety. The route home took us through several busy intersections where Saturday evening traffic was beginning to pick up as people headed out for dinner and entertainment. Tyler commented on how different the city looked from the passenger seat compared to the times he'd driven while impaired, noting details about road construction and new businesses that he'd missed during his periods of heaviest drug use. His observations reflected a clarity and presence that gave me hope about his potential for recovery. As we approached the intersection of Camelback Road and 32nd Street, one of Phoenix's busier crossroads during weekend evening hours, Tyler suddenly became animated about something he'd spotted in the distance. He pointed toward what appeared to be an accident scene several blocks ahead, with flashing lights visible through the desert twilight. His interest in the emergency response seemed natural enough, given our family's recent focus on safety and risk management during our discussions about insurance coverage. The traffic light at Camelback and 32nd Street had just turned yellow as we approached the intersection. I began slowing down to stop, following the defensive driving habits Dad had drilled into both Tyler and me from the moment we'd started learning to drive. Safety had always been a core value in our household, with both parents emphasizing the importance of careful attention and conservative choices when operating vehicles that could cause serious harm to ourselves or others. Tyler's behavior shifted dramatically as we neared the intersection. Instead of remaining calm and supportive as he'd been throughout the evening, he suddenly became agitated and insistent that we needed to hurry through the intersection rather than stopping for the yellow light. His voice took on an urgent tone that seemed disproportionate to our situation, since we had no particular deadline to meet and had already established that the counseling office appointment had been unsuccessful. When I maintained my decision to stop safely rather than rushing through the intersection, Tyler grabbed the steering wheel and yanked it sharply to the right while simultaneously pressing his foot over mine on the accelerator. The Honda lurched forward into the intersection just as the light turned red, directly into the path of oncoming traffic that had begun moving on their green signal. The suddenness of Tyler's actions left me no time to react or regain control before impact became inevitable. The collision happened with the kind of violence that transforms ordinary moments into life-altering catastrophes. A pickup truck traveling eastbound on Camelback Road struck the passenger side of my Honda at approximately 40 miles per hour, spinning us completely around and sending Tyler's side of the car into a concrete barrier that separated the intersection from a strip mall parking lot. The sounds of crushing metal, shattering glass, and screaming brakes created a chaos that seemed to last forever while probably occurring within seconds. The impact knocked me unconscious briefly, though I regained awareness while still trapped in the driver's seat with the steering wheel pinned against my chest and my left leg twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. Tyler appeared to be unconscious or worse, slumped against his door with blood visible on his face and no immediate signs of movement or breathing. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber filled the car's interior, adding urgency to a situation that already felt desperate and terrifying. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the collision, though their approach seemed unusually quick and well-coordinated for a typical accident response. Paramedics worked to extract both Tyler and me from the wreckage, while police officers began documenting the scene and interviewing witnesses who'd observed the collision from various vantage points around the intersection. The efficiency of their response suggested they'd been positioned nearby, though at the time I attributed this to Phoenix's generally effective emergency services. My injuries included 3 broken ribs, a fractured left femur, significant bruising across my torso from the seatbelt and airbag, and a concussion that left me disoriented and struggling to piece together exactly what had happened in the moments before impact. Tyler's condition appeared more serious, with head trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures that required immediate surgical intervention. Both of us were transported to Camelback Medical Center, where trauma teams worked to stabilize our conditions and assess the full extent of our injuries. Jake arrived at the hospital within an hour of the accident, having been contacted by police officers who'd found his information in my phone's emergency contacts. His face showed the kind of panic and relief that comes with nearly losing someone you love, and he stayed by my bedside throughout the initial medical evaluations and treatment procedures. When I was coherent enough to communicate, I tried explaining Tyler's strange behavior in the moments before the collision, though my concussion made it difficult to organize my thoughts clearly. My parents appeared at the hospital shortly after. Jake, both displaying appropriate levels of shock and concern about their children's serious injuries. Mom seemed particularly distraught about Tyler's condition, which required emergency surgery to address internal bleeding and stabilize his vital signs. Dad focused on practical matters like insurance notification and communication with medical staff, maintaining his typical role as the family's primary problem solver during crisis situations. The first night in the hospital passed in a blur of medical procedures, pain medication, and brief visits from family members when hospital staff permitted. Jake remained as close as possible despite visiting our restrictions, providing emotional support and helping me communicate with doctors when my concussion symptoms made concentration difficult. The initial prognosis suggested that both Tyler and I would recover from our injuries, though the process would likely require months of rehabilitation and physical therapy. During my second day of hospitalization, while Tyler remained in intensive care following his surgery, I began experiencing troubling flashbacks about the moments leading up to our collision. Despite my concussion, certain details about Tyler's behavior seemed increasingly clear and disturbing. His sudden urgency about proceeding through the intersection, his physical intervention with the steering wheel and accelerator, and his apparent knowledge about where we needed to be positioned for maximum impact suggested planning rather than impulsive panic. These concerns felt almost too terrible to consider seriously, given the loyalty and love I'd always felt toward my brother. Tyler's addiction had certainly affected his judgment and behavior in destructive ways, but deliberately causing an accident that could have killed both of us seemed beyond even his most impaired decision-making. Nevertheless, the sequence of events continued bothering me as I replayed them during long hours of hospital recovery, searching for alternative explanations that might make more sense. Jake noticed my growing preoccupation with understanding exactly what had happened during the accident, though he initially attributed my concerns to normal trauma processing rather than suspicions about Tyler's intentions. He encouraged me to focus on physical recovery rather than dwelling on details that might never be fully clear, especially given my head injury and the chaotic nature of the collision itself. His practical approach typically helped me maintain perspective during stressful situations, but this time his reassurances felt insufficient. The police report from our accident indicated that Tyler and I had proceeded through a red light into oncoming traffic, resulting in what appeared to be a straightforward case of driver error or inattention. No mention was made of Tyler's interference with my driving, though I realized that such details would be difficult to verify without witnesses inside our vehicle. The other driver involved in the collision had not been cited, since he'd been proceeding legally through the intersection on a green light when we entered his path unexpectedly. Insurance representatives from my auto policy began contacting me during my third day of hospitalization to discuss claim processing and coverage details. Their questions focused heavily on the circumstances of the accident, my driving record, and any factors that might have contributed to what they described as an unusual collision pattern. These conversations felt routine initially, though certain inquiries about my medical history and family relationships seemed more personal than necessary for standard claim investigation. Tyler regained consciousness on my fourth day in the UCEPR hospital, though his head injury left him confused and largely unable to recall specific details about our drive or the accident itself. When I attempted to discuss his behavior in the car before impact, he appeared genuinely puzzled by my questions and insisted he remembered nothing after leaving our parents' house for what he believed had been a simple errand. His memory loss could easily be attributed to his injuries, but it also conveniently eliminated the most troubling aspects of our shared experience. My parents spent significant time at the hospital during both Tyler's and my recovery periods, maintaining appropriate levels of concern and support while managing the practical aspects of our care and insurance coordination. Mom took leave from her teaching position to be available for medical appointments and decision-making, while Dad arranged coverage at his auto repair shop to ensure family needs took priority over business obligations. Their dedication seemed entirely consistent with their character and values. Nevertheless, subtle aspects of their behavior during this period began striking me as unusual or inconsistent with their typical patterns. Mom's questions about my insurance coverage became increasingly detailed and specific, extending beyond what seemed necessary for coordinating medical care. Dad's conversations with hospital staff and insurance representatives displayed a familiarity with policy language and claim procedures that seemed sophisticated for someone whose primary experience involved automotive rather than medical insurance. During my final days of hospitalization, I overheard a phone conversation between my parents and someone they addressed as their insurance agent, discussing aspects of my coverage that I hadn't realized they knew about in such detail. Their discussion included references to policy limits, coverage categories, and claim timeframes that suggested they'd studied my insurance documents more thoroughly than I would have expected. When I mentioned this conversation later, they explained it as natural parental concern about ensuring adequate coverage for my medical expenses. The discharge planning process revealed the extensive rehabilitation requirements that both Tyler and I would need to address our injuries and return to normal functioning. My fractured femur would require months of physical therapy, ironically in the same type of facility where I worked helping other patients recover from similar injuries. Tyler's head trauma and internal injuries necessitated ongoing medical monitoring and gradual reintegration into daily activities, assuming his recovery progressed without complications. Jake arranged temporary disability accommodations that would allow me to work limited hours at the rehabilitation center once my own therapy progressed sufficiently. His accounting background proved invaluable for navigating the complex intersection of insurance benefits, disability policies, and medical expense management that characterized recovery from serious accidents. Together, we developed plans for modifying our apartment and daily routines to accommodate my mobility limitations during the healing process. Tyler's discharge from the hospital coincided with his acceptance into the residential addiction treatment program that our family had been struggling to finance before the accident. Mom announced this development with obvious relief and gratitude, explaining that his medical insurance from the accident had somehow created additional coverage options for addiction treatment that hadn't been available previously. The timing seemed remarkably fortunate, given how desperately we'd all wanted him to receive professional help. The financial aspects of our accident's aftermath proved surprisingly positive for our family's overall situation. Insurance settlements for both Tyler's and my injuries, combined with coverage for medical expenses and lost wages, provided resources that exceeded our immediate needs and created opportunities for longer-term financial planning. Mom and Dad expressed amazement at how what had initially seemed like a devastating crisis had somehow resolved many of the money problems that had been keeping Tyler from accessing treatment. These positive outcomes should have brought relief and happiness as our family moved forward from the trauma of the accident. Instead, I found myself increasingly troubled by the convenient timing and beneficial results that had emerged from what should have been a purely unfortunate incident. The combination of Tyler's memory loss, my parents' detailed knowledge of insurance procedures, and the perfect resolution of our financial obstacles created a pattern that seemed too orchestrated to be coincidental. During my first weeks of outpatient physical therapy, I began researching accident investigation procedures and insurance fraud detection methods, initially telling myself that professional curiosity rather than family suspicion motivated my interest. The more I learned about how staged accidents were planned and executed, the more disturbing parallels I noticed with the circumstances surrounding our collision. The specific intersection, the timing of Tyler's intervention, and even the angle of impact seemed consistent with scenarios designed to maximize insurance payouts while minimizing the risk of fatal injuries. These suspicions felt like betrayal even to consider, given the love and support my parents had always provided throughout my life. Nevertheless, the evidence continued accumulating in ways that made innocent explanations increasingly difficult to maintain. Tyler's selective memory loss, our parents' suspicious familiarity with insurance procedures, and the remarkably beneficial financial outcomes all pointed toward a level of planning and manipulation that challenged everything I believed about my family's character and values. The decision to investigate further rather than accepting the accident as a random misfortune represented a fundamental shift in how I viewed my relationship with my parents and brother. For 28 years, I had trusted their guidance and protection without question, assuming that family loyalty was a mutual commitment rather than a one-sided obligation. The possibility that they had deliberately endangered my life for financial gain forced me to reconsider not only recent events, but also patterns of behavior and decision-making that I had previously attributed to love and concern. The rehabilitation process at Desert Springs forced me to confront my physical limitations, while my mind wrestled with increasingly disturbing questions about my family's integrity. Each day brought small improvements in mobility and strength, yet my emotional state deteriorated as inconsistencies in the accident narrative became harder to ignore. Working alongside colleagues who had witnessed my transformation from confident therapist to struggling patient created an odd perspective on the healing process and the stories people tell themselves about their trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen, my attending physician and no relation despite sharing my surname, noted my unusual preoccupation with technical details about car accidents during routine follow-up appointments. Most patients focused on pain management and functional recovery, while I peppered her with questions about injury patterns, collision dynamics, and forensic evidence collection. When she gently suggested that fixating on accident specifics might interfere with emotional healing, I claimed professional curiosity, rather than revealing my growing suspicions about deliberate orchestration. Jake observed my increasing restlessness and distraction with growing concern, though he continued attributing my behavior to normal trauma responses rather than considering more sinister explanations. His practical nature preferred focusing on concrete recovery goals rather than exploring hypothetical scenarios that might never be proven. During quiet evenings in our apartment, he'd encourage me to concentrate on physical therapy exercises and returning to work rather than dwelling on questions that seemed unanswerable and potentially destructive to family relationships. The insurance settlement negotiations proceeded with remarkable efficiency, considering the complexity of our claims and the multiple parties involved. Our family's designated representative, a claims adjuster named Margaret Foster, demonstrated an impressive familiarity with policy details and coverage options that expedited the entire process. Her expertise seemed almost too convenient, given the typically bureaucratic nature of insurance companies and their reputation for minimizing payouts rather than maximizing benefits for claimants. During one particularly revealing conversation with Ms. Foster, she mentioned specific aspects of my driving record and medical history that I hadn't recalled providing to her or any other insurance representative. When I questioned how she'd obtained such detailed personal information, she explained that thorough background research was standard procedure for significant claims involving potential liability issues. Her explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, though something about her tone suggested rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous clarification. Tyler's recovery followed a trajectory that seemed almost too perfectly aligned with his admission timeline for the residential treatment program. His head trauma symptoms resolved just quickly enough to meet the facility's medical clearance requirements, while his other injuries stabilized at levels that wouldn't interfere with participating in intensive therapy sessions. The timing struck me as remarkably fortunate, given how desperately our family had wanted him in treatment before the accident created these new opportunities. Mom's daily visits to both Tyler and me during our respective recovery periods provided numerous opportunities to observe her behavior and listen for telling details about her knowledge of our situation. Her conversations with medical staff displayed a sophisticated understanding of insurance coordination and claim management that seemed inconsistent with her background as a high school guidance counselor. When questioned about her expertise, she attributed it to research she'd conducted after Tyler's overdose to better advocate for his medical needs. The residential treatment facility that accepted Tyler specialized in trauma-informed addiction recovery, with particular emphasis on helping patients process life-threatening experiences that had contributed to their substance abuse patterns. His counselors described the car accident as a potential catalyst for positive change, suggesting that surviving such a serious collision might provide motivation for maintaining sobriety that previous interventions had failed to achieve. Their optimism felt genuine, though I wondered whether they understood the full circumstances surrounding Tyler's admission to their program. Dad's behavior during this period included subtle changes in routine and priorities that might have escaped notice under normal circumstances. His auto repair shop, typically busy with weekend appointments and emergency calls, seemed to require less of his attention than usual. When I mentioned this observation, he explained that his assistant manager had recently become more capable of handling complex repairs independently, allowing him to focus on family needs during our crisis. The explanation was plausible, though. His newfound flexibility seemed remarkably well-timed. Extended family members began reaching out with support and concern as news of our accident spread through our community networks. Aunt Carmen visited frequently, bringing meals and offering assistance with household tasks that my parents couldn't manage while splitting time between hospital visits and work obligations. Her conversations revealed that she'd been somewhat aware of Tyler's addiction struggles, though she seemed surprised by the severity of his condition and the financial burden his treatment represented for our family. During one of Aunt Carmen's visits, she mentioned a conversation she'd had with Mom several weeks before our accident, in which Mom had expressed desperation about finding resources to help Tyler before his addiction killed him. According to Carmen, Mom had researched various funding options and insurance loopholes that might provide access to expensive treatment programs. This information aligned with my growing suspicions about deliberate planning, though Carmen presented it as evidence of maternal dedication rather than potential conspiracy. Grandma Rosa, despite her advanced age and limited mobility, insisted on visiting both Tyler and me during our hospital stays. Her observations about our family dynamics carried the weight of decades of experience, watching 3 generations navigate various crises and challenges. During one particularly lucid conversation, she mentioned that our accident reminded her of a situation from her youth in Mexico, where desperate families sometimes created opportunities for insurance compensation when medical emergencies threatened their financial survival. The specificity of Grandma Rosa's comparison troubled me more than her usual storytelling, which typically involved vague morality tales rather than detailed parallels to current events. When I pressed her for more information about the historical incident she'd referenced, she became evasive and suggested that old country solutions weren't appropriate for modern American problems. Her reluctance to elaborate seemed uncharacteristic for someone who usually enjoyed sharing family history and cultural wisdom with younger generations. Jake's parents, Georgia and Michael Morrison, provided steady support throughout my recovery process, while maintaining respectful boundaries with my family's decision-making and medical coordination. Their practical assistance with daily tasks and emotional encouragement created a stable foundation that allowed me to focus on healing without worrying about basic needs. However, their outsider perspective on our family's behavior occasionally surfaced observations that aligned with my growing concerns about the accident's circumstances. Georgia mentioned during one visit that she'd been surprised by how quickly our insurance claims were processed and how generous the settlements seemed compared to typical coverage for similar accidents. Her husband's experience in risk management for his accounting firm had given them both familiarity with insurance procedures, and they found our family's financial recovery unusually swift and comprehensive. When I shared their observations with my parents, they attributed the positive outcomes to having maintained excellent coverage and working with responsive insurance representatives. The investigation into our accident remained officially classified as driver error, resulting from failure to observe traffic signals, though I began researching whether additional inquiries might be warranted given the unusual circumstances surrounding our collision. Police reports indicated that several witnesses had observed our Honda proceeding through the red light, but none mentioned seeing any struggle for control of the vehicle or evidence of deliberate interference with normal driving procedures. The absence of witness accounts supporting my memories felt isolating and confusing. Traffic camera footage from the intersection where our accident occurred had been routine archived according to standard municipal procedures, making it unavailable for review without formal legal requests that seemed unlikely to be approved for a closed case. The timing of the footage's removal seemed suspiciously convenient, though city officials explained that storage limitations required regular deletion of surveillance data unless specifically flagged for ongoing investigations or legal proceedings. Tyler's memory of events leading up to our collision remained frustratingly incomplete, even as his other cognitive functions recovered from the head trauma. He recalled our dinner conversation and agreeing to accompany me on the errand to the counseling office, but everything from the parking lot onward existed as blank space in his recollection. Medical professionals assured me that selective memory loss was common following head injuries, though the specific pattern of Tyler's amnesia seemed remarkably convenient for avoiding difficult questions. During my 6th week of outpatient physical therapy, I encountered Dr. Martinez, the counselor we'd supposedly been scheduled to meet on the evening of our accident. Our conversation revealed that he had no record of any after-hours appointment with Tyler or our family, and his office had been unoccupied that Saturday evening as he attended his daughter's quinceañera celebration. The discrepancy between Mom's instructions and Dr. Martinez's actual whereabouts represented the first concrete evidence that our errand had been fabricated. This discovery forced me to confront the possibility that our entire evening had been orchestrated to place Tyler and me in a specific location at a predetermined time for purposes I was only beginning to understand. The realization that Mom had deliberately sent us on a false errand felt like a fundamental violation of trust that challenged everything I believed about our family relationships. If she could lie about something so basic, what other deceptions might be hidden beneath the surface of her apparent concern and support? The financial benefits flowing from our accident continued accumulating in ways that seemed almost too generous for typical insurance coverage. Medical expenses for both Tyler and me were covered completely, with additional compensation for pain and suffering that exceeded what I'd expected based on research into similar cases. Tyler's addiction treatment costs, which had seemed insurmountable before our collision, were now fully funded through a combination of insurance benefits and supplemental coverage that had somehow become available following the accident. Mom's explanations for these favorable outcomes focused on the importance of maintaining comprehensive insurance coverage and working with experienced professionals who understood how to maximize legitimate benefits. She presented our financial recovery as a silver lining to an otherwise tragic situation, suggesting that our suffering had at least resulted in positive outcomes that would help Tyler overcome his addiction and allow our family to move forward without devastating debt. Her perspective seemed reasonable on the surface, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she understood far more about insurance procedures than a typical policyholder would. Dad's involvement in the insurance process included detailed knowledge of automotive damage assessment and repair cost estimation that aligned with his professional expertise, but extended into areas that seemed beyond normal mechanic training. His conversations with adjusters and claims investigators demonstrated familiarity with policy language and coverage interpretation that suggested extensive preparation rather than natural aptitude. When I complimented his expertise, he attributed it to decades of dealing with insurance companies through his auto repair business. The residential treatment facility where Tyler was now living provided regular updates about his progress and engagement with their program. His counselors reported that he was responding well to individual therapy and group sessions, showing genuine commitment to understanding the root causes of his addiction and developing healthy coping strategies. The positive reports should have brought relief and hope for his long-term recovery. Yet I found myself questioning whether his placement in this particular program had been influenced by factors beyond his clinical needs. Jake's growing concern about my preoccupation with accident details and insurance procedures led to several difficult conversations about the importance of focusing on our shared future, rather than dwelling on questions that might never be satisfactorily answered. He worried that my suspicions about family involvement were becoming unhealthy fixations that could damage relationships permanently without necessarily revealing any actionable truth. His practical perspective typically helped me maintain balance during stressful periods, but this time his advice felt like pressure to ignore evidence rather than thoughtful guidance. The approaching 3-month anniversary of our accident marked significant milestones in both my physical recovery and Tyler's addiction treatment progress. My fractured femur had healed sufficiently to allow full weight bearing and return to work with minimal restrictions, while Tyler was scheduled to complete the residential phase of his program and transition to outpatient services. These positive developments should have represented triumph over adversity and family healing. Yet I felt increasingly isolated by suspicions that I couldn't share with anyone who might understand or validate my concerns. Sleep became elusive as my mind replayed details from the evening of our accident, searching for alternative explanations that might reconcile my memories with the official narrative. Tyler's sudden aggression in grabbing the steering wheel and forcing us into oncoming traffic seemed increasingly difficult to attribute to impaired judgment or panic about being late for a non-existent appointment. The precision of his timing and the effectiveness of his intervention suggested planning and practice rather than spontaneous poor decision-making. Research into insurance fraud prosecution revealed that family members were rarely investigated for staging accidents involving their own relatives, especially when the relationships appeared loving and supportive on the surface. The emotional bonds and shared financial interests that typically characterize family dynamics created natural cover for collaborative deception that outside investigators might find difficult to detect or prove. Understanding these patterns made me realize how perfectly our situation fit common fraud scenarios while maintaining plausible deniability for all participants. The weight of keeping these suspicions private while continuing to interact normally with my parents and support Tyler's recovery created enormous emotional strain that began affecting my professional performance and personal relationships. Colleagues at the rehabilitation center noticed my distraction and mood changes, though they attributed these symptoms to normal adjustment challenges following serious trauma. Jake observed similar changes in my behavior and personality, expressing concern about depression or post-traumatic stress that might require professional intervention. My parents' behavior during family gatherings and medical appointments maintained appropriate levels of concern and support, while occasionally revealing knowledge or preparation that seemed inconsistent with their supposed surprise about the accident and its aftermath. Mom's familiarity with rehabilitation timelines and insurance coordination procedures, combined with Dad's detailed understanding of automotive forensics and collision dynamics, created a pattern of expertise that extended beyond what they should have known, unless they'd researched these topics extensively before our accident occurred. The decision to investigate further, rather than accepting our situation as an unfortunate coincidence with fortunate outcomes, represented a crossroads in my relationship with my family and my understanding of myself. For 28 years, I had trusted their judgment and protection implicitly, assuming that love and loyalty were mutual commitments rather than strategic considerations. The possibility that they had deliberately endangered my life for financial gain challenged not only my perception of recent events, but also my entire framework for understanding family relationships and moral obligations. Evening visits to Tyler at the treatment facility provided opportunities to observe his recovery progress while carefully probing for any recovered memories about our accident that might clarify the circumstances surrounding our collision. His engagement with the program seemed genuine and productive, with counselors noting significant improvements in his ability to discuss addiction triggers and develop healthy coping strategies. Nevertheless, his continued inability to recall specific details about our drive or the moments before impact felt increasingly suspicious, given his otherwise sharp memory for other recent events. The treatment facility's financial coordinator mentioned during one conversation that Tyler's coverage situation was unusually comprehensive for someone his age without employer-based insurance. The combination of medical benefits from the accident and supplemental addiction treatment coverage created funding streams that covered not only his current program, but also extended aftercare services that typically required significant out-of-pocket expenses. While this arrangement benefited Tyler's recovery prospects, it also represented another example of remarkably convenient outcomes resulting from our supposedly random accident. Jake's patience with my ongoing investigation into family behavior and insurance procedures began wearing thin as weeks passed without any definitive proof of wrongdoing or clear path toward resolution. He argued that even if my suspicions were correct, pursuing them would likely destroy family relationships without necessarily providing legal remedies or emotional closure. His perspective reflected genuine concern for my well-being combined with practical recognition that some truths might be too costly to pursue, regardless of their validity. The approaching holiday season created additional pressure to maintain normal family interactions while harboring serious doubts about my parents' integrity and Tyler's truthfulness about the accident. Mom began planning Thanksgiving dinner with enthusiasm that seemed forced, as if family traditions could somehow restore the harmony and trust that I felt slipping away despite our outwardly positive recovery outcomes. The prospect of sitting around our dining table expressing gratitude for our survival and Tyler's treatment opportunities felt increasingly hypocritical, as evidence mounted that these blessings might have been purchased with deliberate endangerment of my life. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in November when I arrived early at the rehabilitation center and found my computer still logged into the patient database from the previous day. A routine check of my own medical records revealed insurance, billing codes that didn't match the services I'd actually received, with several procedures listed that had never been performed. More disturbing was the presence of pre-authorization requests dated 2 days before our accident, suggesting that someone had anticipated my specific injuries and begun processing claims before the collision occurred. My hands trembled as I printed copies of the fraudulent billing records, each page representing another piece of evidence that my family had planned every aspect of my near-death experience. The medical codes indicated treatments for fractures, head trauma, and internal injuries that perfectly matched the actual damage Tyler and I sustained, despite being submitted before we'd supposedly driven to that fabricated counseling appointment. The precision of these predictions eliminated any remaining possibility that our accident had been coincidental or spontaneous. Jake found me crying in our apartment that evening, surrounded by printed insurance documents and research about fraud, prosecution procedures. When I finally showed him the predated authorization forms, his face went pale with the same shock and betrayal I'd been carrying for weeks. His practical nature, which had previously encouraged me to let sleeping dogs lie, suddenly shifted, toward protective anger as he realized the extent of my family's deception and the genuine danger they'd placed me in for financial gain. The decision to contact law enforcement rather than confronting my parents directly came after consulting with Patricia Brennan, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in insurance fraud cases. She reviewed my documentation with professional detachment, noting that while the evidence strongly suggested coordinated deception, prosecuting family members required particularly compelling proof due to juries' reluctance to believe that parents would deliberately endanger their children. Nevertheless, she agreed to represent me if I chose to pursue legal action. Detective Maria Santos from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit listened to my presentation with the skeptical attention of someone who'd investigated numerous insurance fraud allegations. Her questions focused on possible alternative explanations for the suspicious circumstances, though her expression grew increasingly serious as I provided documentation of the predated medical authorizations and fabricated counseling appointment. When I finished presenting my evidence, she agreed that formal investigation was warranted, despite the sensitive family dynamics involved. The criminal investigation proceeded quietly over the following weeks, with Detective Santos conducting interviews and gathering additional evidence without alerting my parents to the scrutiny their actions were receiving. Subpoenas for phone records revealed extensive communication between Mom, Dad, and Margaret Foster, the insurance adjuster, in the days leading up to our accident. Text message records showed detailed discussions about timing, locations, and injury severity that contradicted their claimed surprise about our collision. Tyler's phone records proved equally damning, showing that he'd received specific instructions from Dad about when and how to interfere with my driving during our supposedly routine errand. Messages deleted from Tyler's device had been recovered. Through carrier records, revealing step-by-step directions for grabbing the steering wheel and forcing us into the intersection at precisely the moment when oncoming traffic would cause maximum damage while minimizing fatal risk. The cold calculation behind these instructions shattered any remaining illusions about my brother's innocence in the conspiracy. The confrontation I'd been dreading came when Detective Santos requested a formal interview with my parents about discrepancies in their insurance claims and statements about the accident. Mom called me in tears after receiving the police contact, claiming that some terrible misunderstanding had led to unwarranted investigation of our family during an already difficult period. Her performance of wounded innocence might have been convincing if I hadn't seen the documented evidence of her coordination with insurance representatives and detailed planning of my injuries. Dad's reaction to the police investigation was characteristically different from Mom's emotional appeals, focusing instead on practical concerns about legal representation and potential consequences. His immediate retention of a criminal defense. Attorney suggested that he understood the seriousness of the charges being considered, despite his attempts to present the investigation as harassment of a family dealing with addiction and accident trauma. The speed with which he secured legal counsel indicated preparation for this possibility, rather than surprise at being questioned. The family meeting called to address the criminal investigation took place in a sterile conference room at Dad's attorney's office, with everyone accompanied by their respective legal representatives. Sitting across a polished table from my parents while my own lawyer reviewed evidence of their conspiracy to harm me felt surreal and heartbreaking in ways I hadn't anticipated. The formal setting stripped away decades of shared history and emotional connection, reducing our relationships to legal positions and strategic considerations. Mom's testimony during the recorded interview revealed the full scope of their financial desperation and the calculated nature of their solution. Tyler's addiction treatment costs had indeed seemed insurmountable through legitimate means, leading them to research insurance fraud schemes that might provide necessary funding. She described their plan as a temporary family sacrifice that would save Tyler's life while providing medical coverage I wouldn't have needed otherwise, presenting their deception as misguided love rather than criminal exploitation. Dad's admission of guilt included technical details about timing the accident and positioning our vehicle for optimal insurance settlements while minimizing fatal injuries. His background in automotive repair had provided expertise in collision, dynamics, and injury patterns that informed their planning process. The intersection at Camelback and 32nd Street had been selected for its traffic patterns and emergency response times, ensuring that help would arrive quickly enough to prevent deaths while allowing sufficient damage to justify substantial insurance payouts. Tyler's involvement in the conspiracy became clear when Detective Santos presented him with the recovered text messages and phone records documenting his coordination with our parents. His claimed memory loss about the accident dissolved when confronted with evidence of his deliberate actions, replaced by tearful admissions about feeling pressured to participate in the scheme as his contribution to funding his own treatment. His addiction had made him desperate enough to risk both our lives for the promise of rehabilitation he couldn't access through honest means. The insurance investigation that paralleled the criminal case revealed additional fraud involving inflated damage claims and fabricated medical treatments that extended far beyond the predated authorizations I'd initially discovered. Margaret Foster, the claims adjuster who'd seemed remarkably helpful during our settlement process, had been collaborating with my parents for months to identify opportunities for profitable staged accidents. Her inside knowledge of policy loopholes and coverage limits had been essential to their planning. The civil lawsuit I filed against my parents, Tyler, and the insurance company sought not only financial restitution, but also accountability for the emotional trauma and betrayal they'd inflicted through their conspiracy. Beyond the monetary damages, I wanted legal recognition that their actions constituted profound violations of trust and family obligations that caused psychological harm extending far beyond the physical injuries they'd deliberately inflicted. The civil case would proceed independently of criminal prosecution, allowing me to pursue justice through multiple channels. Jake's unwavering support throughout the legal proceedings provided emotional stability that allowed me to maintain focus on seeking justice rather than being overwhelmed by grief and anger. His practical assistance with documentation and court appearances, combined with his emotional presence during difficult moments, demonstrated the kind of family loyalty I'd mistakenly believed existed with my birth relatives. Our relationship deepened through shared adversity in ways that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. The media attention surrounding a family insurance fraud case involving deliberately staged accidents created public scrutiny that complicated everyone's lives while raising awareness about this type of crime. Local news coverage focused on the unusual family dynamics and the sophisticated planning required to execute such a scheme, though reporters struggled to convey the emotional complexity of prosecuting parents who claimed their actions were motivated by love for an addicted child, rather than simple greed. Aunt Carmen's support during the legal proceedings provided a crucial bridge to extended family members who struggled to understand how the situation had deteriorated so dramatically. Her perspective as someone who'd witnessed Tyler's addiction crisis and our parents' desperation helped relatives understand the context behind their criminal choices, without excusing the fundamental betrayal those choices represented. Her willingness to testify about conversations that supported my version of events demonstrated courage that inspired my own determination to see justice through to completion. The plea negotiations revealed the strength of the prosecution's case while highlighting the unique emotional challenges involved in family crime prosecution. Dad's attorney argued for reduced charges based on his client's lack of prior criminal history and genuine concern for Tyler's well-being, while the prosecutor emphasized the sophisticated planning and deliberate endangerment that characterized their scheme. Mom's lawyer focused on her role as a mother driven to desperate measures by watching her son slowly die from addiction. Tyler's cooperation with the investigation in exchange for reduced sentencing provided crucial testimony about the family's planning process and his own reluctant participation in their scheme. His detailed account of receiving instructions about when and how to interfere with my driving eliminated any remaining doubt about the deliberate nature of our accident. His addiction counselors noted that accepting responsibility for his actions represented important progress in his recovery program, though they worried about the impact of criminal consequences on his sobriety maintenance. The trial proceedings stretched over several weeks, with testimony from medical experts, insurance investigators, and family members who painted a complex picture of love, desperation, and betrayal that challenged conventional understanding of family loyalty and criminal motivation. Jurors struggled with the emotional aspects of the case while weighing clear evidence of conspiracy and deliberate endangerment against sympathetic portrayals of parents trying to save their addicted son through misguided means. The guilty verdicts, on multiple counts of insurance fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment, brought legal validation for my pursuit of justice, while failing to provide the emotional closure I'd hoped prosecution might deliver. Watching my parents and brother sentenced to prison terms and financial restitution felt like Pyrrhic victory that had cost our family relationships permanently, while establishing important legal precedents about accountability for staged accident schemes. The financial restitution ordered by the court included repayment of fraudulent insurance claims plus punitive damages that reflected the severity of deliberately endangering family members for monetary gain. While the money couldn't repair the emotional damage or restore trust that had been destroyed, it provided resources for therapy and life rebuilding that I wouldn't have been able to afford otherwise. More importantly, the court's recognition of their wrongdoing validated my decision to pursue justice despite enormous personal costs. Tyler's sentencing to rehabilitation supervision rather than traditional incarceration reflected the court's recognition of his addiction issues and cooperation with the investigation. His continued treatment would now occur under judicial oversight with strict accountability measures that might provide better structure for long-term recovery than voluntary programs had achieved. Our relationship remained complicated by his betrayal, though his genuine remorse and acceptance of responsibility offered some hope for eventual reconciliation. The aftermath of the trial left me essentially orphaned from my birth family, while building stronger connections with Jake's relatives and the chosen family of friends who'd supported me throughout the legal proceedings. Holidays and family traditions required complete reinvention, though these new celebrations often felt more authentic than the performances of harmony that had characterized our gatherings during Tyler's addiction crisis. The absence of deception and manipulation created space for genuine relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Jake and I married 6 months after the trial concluded, in a small ceremony attended by people who'd proven their loyalty through actions rather than blood relationships. Our vows included promises about honesty and protection that carried deeper meaning given what we'd experienced together. The wedding represented not just our commitment to each other, but also our rejection of family dynamics based on exploitation and our embrace of relationships founded on genuine care and respect. My return to full-time work at the rehabilitation center provided purpose and meaning that helped process the trauma of betrayal, while using my experience to help other patients navigate complex family dynamics during their recovery. Understanding how desperation can corrupt love and loyalty gave me insights that benefited both my professional practice and personal healing. Many patients dealing with family substance abuse issues found comfort in knowing that someone understood the impossible choices and painful consequences that addiction creates for everyone involved. The insurance industry reforms that resulted from our case included stricter verification procedures for medical pre-authorizations and enhanced investigation protocols for accidents involving family members with financial motivations. While these changes couldn't prevent all fraud, they made sophisticated staged accident schemes more difficult to execute successfully. Knowing that our painful experience might protect other families from similar exploitation provided some measure of meaning to the trauma we'd endured. Detective Santos maintained periodic contact to provide updates about related cases and ongoing investigations into organized insurance fraud networks that might have connections to our situation. Her work revealed that family-based staged accidents were more common than generally recognized, often involving desperate parents who convinced themselves that insurance fraud was a victimless crime that would help rather than harm their children. Understanding this pattern helped me recognize that our experience wasn't unique, though that knowledge brought little comfort. The long-term psychological impact of learning that my parents had deliberately endangered my life required ongoing therapy to process feelings of betrayal, grief, and anger that couldn't be resolved through legal proceedings alone. Working with a counselor who specialized in family trauma helped me understand that my parents' actions, while inexcusable, emerged from desperation and fear rather than malicious intent. This perspective didn't excuse their choices, but provided context that made healing possible. Years later, limited contact with my parents through supervised visits and carefully structured communication revealed the ongoing consequences of their choices for their own lives and relationships. Dad's auto repair business had been lost due to legal fees and restitution payments, while Mom's teaching career ended with her criminal conviction. Their marriage survived the legal proceedings, but remained strained by guilt and mutual recrimination about decisions that had destroyed their family while failing to provide lasting help for Tyler's addiction. Tyler's recovery journey continued, with mixed results, as his underlying addiction issues proved more resilient than any of us had hoped when the crisis first emerged. The structure and accountability imposed by court supervision helped maintain periods of sobriety, though relapse remained an ongoing risk that required constant vigilance and support. Our relationship slowly rebuilt around acceptance of past choices and shared commitment to preventing similar harm in the future. The insurance money that had motivated my family's conspiracy was eventually fully recovered through civil litigation and criminal restitution orders, though the financial costs of the legal proceedings consumed significant portions of the fraudulent gains. More importantly, the insurance companies involved implemented policy changes that made similar schemes more difficult to execute, potentially protecting countless other families from experiencing comparable betrayals. Jake and I eventually started our own family, with 2 children who would grow up understanding the importance of honesty, integrity, and genuine love that protects rather than exploits. Our parenting philosophy emphasizes open communication and respect for boundaries that were absent from my childhood experience. While our children know the basic facts about why they have limited contact with my birth family, we focus on building relationships based on trust and mutual respect rather than obligation and manipulation. The physical scars from our staged accident faded over time, but the emotional growth that resulted from surviving betrayal and pursuing justice created strength and wisdom that enhanced every aspect of my life. Learning to trust my instincts despite pressure to maintain family harmony, standing up for truth despite painful consequences, and building chosen family relationships based on genuine care rather than biological obligation transformed me into someone more authentic and resilient than the person I'd been before that terrible Tuesday evening. Looking back, the worst thing my family ever did to me was also the catalyst for discovering who I really was and what I truly valued. Their betrayal taught me that love without respect is manipulation, that family loyalty should never require accepting abuse, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their harmful choices. These lessons, learned at tremendous personal cost, became the foundation for building a life based on integrity and genuine connection rather than obligation and fear. The insurance company's internal investigation report arrived at my attorney's office 3 months after the criminal trial concluded, revealing the full scope of the fraud network that had facilitated my family's scheme. Margaret Foster hadn't been a rogue agent working independently, but rather part of a sophisticated operation that had been staging accidents across Arizona for nearly 5 years. The documentation showed dozens of families who had been recruited into similar conspiracies, each believing they were participating in isolated incidents rather than organized criminal enterprise. Detective Santos contacted me personally to explain how our case had become the breakthrough that exposed this larger network. The meticulous documentation I'd compiled and the willingness to prosecute family members had provided prosecutors with leverage they'd never possessed in previous investigations. Most victims of staged family accidents had been too emotionally compromised or financially dependent to pursue legal action, allowing the conspiracy to continue expanding across multiple insurance companies and geographic regions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation assumed jurisdiction over the broader fraud network investigation, with Agent Rebecca Martinez assigned as the lead investigator for cases involving family exploitation. Her background in organized crime prosecution brought new perspective to understanding how emotional manipulation and financial desperation had been weaponized to recruit ordinary families into criminal activity. The psychological profiles she developed helped identify other potential victims who might not have recognized their experiences as deliberate fraud. Tyler's testimony before the federal grand jury provided crucial insight into the recruitment process that had targeted our family during his addiction crisis. The initial contact had come through his rehabilitation counselor, who had been receiving kickbacks for identifying families facing overwhelming medical expenses and emotional vulnerability. The systematic nature of this exploitation revealed how addiction treatment facilities had been infiltrated by criminal organizations seeking to profit from desperate families' willingness to do anything to save their loved ones. The class action lawsuit filed against the insurance companies involved in the fraud network included nearly 200 families who had been victimized through staged accidents orchestrated by the same criminal organization. Our case served as the lead plaintiff example due to the extensive documentation and successful criminal prosecution that had established clear precedent for corporate liability. The legal proceedings would likely continue for years, but the potential financial recovery could provide compensation for families who had suffered both physical and emotional trauma. Jake's decision to leave his accounting firm and start his own practice specializing in forensic financial investigation grew directly from his experience helping me navigate the complex intersection of insurance fraud and family betrayal. His new career allowed him to assist other families who suspected they'd been victimized by similar schemes, while providing expertise that law enforcement agencies increasingly needed to prosecute sophisticated white-collar crimes. The work gave him purpose that went beyond typical accounting services. My parents' appeals of their criminal convictions were denied at every level, with appellate courts noting the particularly egregious nature of deliberately endangering family members for financial gain. The legal precedent established by their case strengthened prosecution tools for similar crimes, while sending clear messages about the consequences of exploiting family relationships for criminal purposes. Their sentences would be served in full, with limited opportunities for early release due to the sophisticated planning involved in their crimes. The victim impact statement I delivered during their sentencing hearing had been broadcast widely, as an example of how insurance fraud affects real families beyond mere financial losses. Speaking publicly about the betrayal and ongoing emotional trauma helped other victims find their voices while educating the general public about warning signs they might encounter in their own families. The courage required to testify against my parents in front of media cameras had been worth the exposure if it prevented even one family from experiencing similar exploitation. Tyler's rehabilitation under court supervision included mandatory participation in a victim impact program where he met with other families who had been harmed by staged accidents. These encounters forced him to confront the full consequences of his actions beyond our immediate family, helping him understand how his choices had contributed to a criminal enterprise that had devastated dozens of innocent people. The perspective gained through these sessions became crucial to his genuine commitment to long-term recovery and making amends. The residential treatment facility where Tyler had been placed during his supposed recovery was permanently closed after federal investigators discovered its systematic involvement in recruiting vulnerable families for fraud schemes. The directors and several counselors faced criminal charges for their roles in identifying and grooming potential victims, while legitimate patients who had been seeking help for addiction issues were transferred to ethical facilities that prioritized healing over criminal profit. Grandma Rosa's death 6 months after the trial removed the last connection to family history and cultural traditions that had shaped my childhood identity. Her final conversations with me included apologies for not speaking up about her suspicions regarding the accident, though she revealed that immigrant experiences with institutional authority had made her reluctant to involve law enforcement in family matters. Her wisdom about recognizing deception and protecting oneself from exploitation became part of the legacy she left for future generations. The documentary film crew that approached me about telling our story initially seemed intrusive and opportunistic, But their commitment to exposing insurance fraud networks and helping other victims ultimately convinced me to participate. The resulting film premiered at several major festivals before being distributed through streaming platforms, reaching audiences who might never have understood how sophisticated these criminal operations had become. The educational impact justified the discomfort of reliving our trauma for public consumption. Aunt Carmen's decision to relocate to Phoenix and become more involved in supporting our rebuilding process provided crucial family continuity during the difficult transition period. Following the trial, her presence helped Jake and me establish new holiday traditions and family gatherings that honored our cultural heritage, while creating safe spaces free from the manipulation and deception that had characterized previous celebrations. Her courage in testifying against my parents had permanently damaged her relationship with her brother, but demonstrated integrity that inspired my own choices. The insurance reforms implemented as a direct result of our case included mandatory waiting periods for medical authorizations involving family members, enhanced investigation protocols for accidents with suspicious circumstances, and stricter oversight of claims adjusters who demonstrated unusually high settlement rates. These changes created additional bureaucratic hurdles that might frustrate legitimate claimants, but would make organized fraud schemes significantly more difficult to execute successfully. My return to graduate school to pursue a master's degree in social work with specialization in family trauma grew from recognizing how my personal experience could be channeled into professional expertise that might help other families navigate similar crises. The academic program provided theoretical frameworks for understanding how love and loyalty could be corrupted by desperation, while developing practical skills for intervention and healing. The degree would allow me to work directly with families, facing addiction crises without exposing them to criminal exploitation. Jake's parents formally adopted me into their family through a symbolic ceremony that acknowledged the permanent severing of relationships with my birth family while celebrating the chosen family connections that had sustained me through the legal proceedings. Their acceptance and support had never wavered despite the complexity and public attention surrounding our situation, demonstrating the kind of unconditional love that I'd mistakenly believed existed with my biological relatives. The ceremony marked an important step in fully embracing new identity and relationships. The support group I started for families affected by staged accident fraud attracted participants from across the Southwest, with some traveling hundreds of miles to connect with others who understood the unique trauma of being victimized by people they'd trusted completely. The monthly meetings provided safe spaces for sharing experiences and developing coping strategies, while also serving as informal intelligence gathering that helped law enforcement identify additional fraud networks. The group's advocacy efforts contributed to legislative changes strengthening penalties for family-based insurance fraud. Tyler's graduation from the court-supervised rehabilitation program marked a significant milestone in his recovery journey, though our relationship remained cautiously limited due to the ongoing impact of his betrayal. His completion of restitution payments and community service requirements demonstrated genuine commitment to making amends, while his work with addiction counselors helping other families avoid exploitation provided meaningful contribution to preventing similar crimes. The possibility of eventual reconciliation remained open, though trust would require years of consistent behavior to rebuild. The civil lawsuit settlement with the insurance companies provided financial compensation that exceeded the original fraudulent claims by substantial margins, reflecting punitive damages designed to deter future corporate negligence in preventing organized fraud networks. The money funded my graduate education, supported victims' advocacy work, and established a foundation dedicated to helping families affected by addiction avoid criminal exploitation. The financial recovery represented justice achieved through persistent legal action, rather than criminal conspiracy. My wedding to Jake took place in a small ceremony attended by chosen family members who had proven their loyalty through actions, rather than claiming it through blood relationships. Our vows included specific promises about honesty, protection, and mutual respect that carried profound meaning given what we'd survived together. The celebration marked not only our romantic, Commitment, but also our shared dedication to building relationships based on integrity rather than manipulation or obligation. The children Jake and I eventually welcomed into our family would grow up with clear understanding that love means protection rather than exploitation, that family loyalty requires mutual respect rather than blind obedience, and that sometimes the most loving response to harmful behavior is accountability rather than enablement. Our parenting philosophy emphasized open communication, critical thinking, and the importance of trusting their instincts even when authority figures pressured them to ignore warning signs. Detective Santos retired from law enforcement after successfully prosecuting the insurance fraud network, but remained involved in training programs that helped other investigators recognize family-based fraud schemes. Her expertise became crucial for developing specialized interrogation techniques and evidence collection procedures that accounted for the emotional complexity of cases involving family members who had victimized each other. Her mentorship continued, influencing how these cases were handled throughout the region. The insurance industry's response to the fraud network exposure included creation of specialized task forces dedicated to identifying and preventing organized fraud schemes that exploited family relationships. The collaboration between insurance companies, law enforcement, and victim advocates represented unprecedented cooperation that had been lacking in previous fraud prevention efforts. The systemic changes promised better protection for future families while ensuring that insurance coverage remained available for legitimate claims. My decision to write a book about our experience grew from recognizing that many families might be facing similar pressures without understanding the criminal nature of what they were being asked to participate in. The published memoir provided detailed warning signs that potential victims could recognize while offering hope for families who had already been exploited, that justice and healing remained possible. The book's success led to speaking engagements that allowed me to reach even broader audiences with important education about protecting family relationships from criminal manipulation. The permanent restraining order I maintained against my parents reflected ongoing concerns about their potential for manipulation and boundary violations, even after serving their prison sentences. While some family members and friends encouraged forgiveness and reconciliation, the legal protection ensured that any future contact would occur on my terms, rather than through surprise encounters or emotional ambushes. The boundary demonstrated that forgiveness didn't require exposure to continued harm or manipulation. Tyler's relapse 18 months after completing his supervised rehabilitation program served as painful reminder that addiction recovery remains an ongoing process rather than a permanent cure achieved through completing treatment programs. His return to drug use violated probation conditions and resulted in additional legal consequences, though he avoided staged accident schemes during this setback. The relapse reinforced my decision to maintain emotional distance while hoping for his eventual genuine recovery. The Victim Compensation Fund, established through the federal prosecution of the fraud network, provided ongoing financial support for families who had suffered long-term consequences from their exploitation. The fund's resources included therapy services, educational assistance, and emergency financial help for families whose participation in staged accidents had created ongoing medical or legal problems. The program represented recognition that victimization by family members created unique trauma requiring specialized support services. Jake's forensic accounting practice expanded to include consultation with federal agencies investigating organized fraud networks, providing expertise that helped prosecutors understand the financial mechanisms that enabled these sophisticated criminal operations. His work contributed to successful prosecutions across multiple states, while generating income that supported our family's financial security and philanthropic activities. The career transition that had begun with our personal trauma evolved into meaningful professional contribution to preventing similar crimes. The documentary about our case won several awards at film festivals dedicated to social justice issues, bringing national attention to the problem of family-based insurance, fraud, and the need for better protection of vulnerable populations. The film's success led to congressional hearings about insurance industry oversight and victim protection programs, demonstrating how personal stories could influence policy changes that might prevent future exploitation. The public exposure justified the emotional cost of sharing our trauma with strangers. My parents' release from prison after serving their full sentences occurred without any attempt at contact or reconciliation, suggesting they understood that their actions had permanently severed our relationships. Reports from their probation officers indicated they had relocated to another state and were living quietly while complying with supervision requirements. The distance provided peace of mind that they wouldn't attempt to reestablish contact or interfere with the life Jake and I had built together. The insurance fraud awareness training program I developed for medical professionals helped healthcare workers recognize when families might be under pressure to participate in staged accident schemes. The curriculum included warning signs, intervention strategies, and reporting procedures that could protect vulnerable patients from exploitation by criminal organizations. The program's adoption by medical schools and professional associations promised to create additional safeguards against family-based fraud recruitment. Tyler's eventual death from an overdose 5 years after our staged accident marked the tragic conclusion to his struggle with addiction and the permanent end to any possibility of family reconciliation. While his participation in the conspiracy had damaged our relationship irreparably, his death still brought grief for the person he might have become if addiction and criminal influences hadn't consumed his potential. The funeral provided closure, while reinforcing the devastating consequences of the choices that had destroyed our family. The foundation Jake and I established in Tyler's memory focused on providing legitimate addiction treatment resources that protected families from criminal exploitation while addressing the underlying desperation that made them vulnerable to fraud schemes. The organization's work included funding for ethical treatment programs, family education about recognizing manipulation, and advocacy for insurance coverage that made legitimate treatment accessible without resorting to criminal activity. The E Foundation represented our commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedy. The legacy of our case extended far beyond personal justice to include systemic changes that protected countless other families from experiencing similar betrayal and exploitation. The legal precedents, policy reforms, victim support programs, and educational initiatives that resulted from our willingness to prosecute family members demonstrated how individual courage could create broader social change. The transformation of personal trauma into public benefit provided meaning that helped heal the emotional wounds that would never fully disappear. Years later, the scars from our staged accident served as daily reminders of both the betrayal I'd survived and the strength I'd discovered through seeking justice despite enormous personal cost. The physical limitations that remained from my injuries couldn't be separated from the wisdom and resilience that had emerged from confronting family manipulation and choosing truth over comfortable lies. The person I'd become through surviving deliberate harm was stronger and more authentic than the trusting daughter who had driven to that fabricated counseling appointment so many years ago. The new family Jake and I created together was built on foundations of honesty, respect, and genuine protection that my birth family had violated so completely. Our children would grow up understanding that real love means safety rather than exploitation, that family loyalty requires mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice, and that sometimes the most loving response to harmful behavior is accountability rather than enablement. The lessons learned through surviving betrayal became wisdom that would protect future generations from similar manipulation. Looking back on the journey from victim to survivor to advocate, I recognized that my family's worst betrayal had ultimately become the catalyst for discovering my own strength and values. Their conspiracy to harm me for financial gain had taught me that authentic relationships required respect for boundaries, that love without safety was manipulation, and that choosing justice over family harmony sometimes represented the highest form of loyalty to one's own integrity and the welfare of future victims who might be protected by precedents established through courageous action. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.